What do venture capitalists and private equity investors actually look for in startups? And more importantly, what do engineers and founders need to know when working with them?
In this episode, we sit down with Danielle Ullner, a veteran venture builder with experience at BCG Digital Ventures, BCG X, as well as multiple VC and PE-backed companies.
We explore what makes startups investable, the desirability, viability, and feasibility framework, and why engineers need to think beyond code when building products.
If you've ever considered founding a startup, working in VC-backed companies, or just understanding what on earth investors care about, this episode is packed with insights you won't want to miss.
I'm James Wilson, and I'm a software engineering recruiter based in London.
I'm Matt Sinclair, a 30-year veteran of the software business. I can't wait to get into this chat with Danielle today. Let's get to it, James.
Let's do it.
I was fortunate enough to work with Danielle for nearly 4 or 5 years, I think it was, Danielle at BCG Digital Ventures here in London. And we've brought Danielle in. I'll let her introduce herself. She's got a storied career, which I'm sure you'll all be interested to hear about. The reason that we brought Danielle in today is I think she gives a unique perspective for software engineers, because not only has she worked very closely with software engineers in the digital ventures business where we're building businesses, but she spent a lot of time in the PE and VC space as well. What we're going to be asking Danielle to talk about today with us and asking her some questions about is what can engineers do to work with those other cohorts that are so important when it comes to building cool products and services. And without saying too much more, I'll hand over to Danielle and let her introduce herself to us all.
Right. Thank you so much for having me here today. And what Matt didn't mention is he was one of the people that interviewed me when I got hired into Boston Consulting Group. So he hit on the importance of working with engineering, product, and design. In fact, it was him and his two colleagues, one from product and one from design, that were on the other side of the table drilling me for an hour and a half. But I guess I passed since we worked together for a number of years at Boston Consulting Group in what evolved to become BCG X. And for those not familiar with BCG X, it's the product, tech, and engineering arm of BCG. And I really focus on building new products, new services, and new businesses with our clients. And our BCG X talent team is comprised of those engineers, data scientists, product, design, growth, a lot of the capabilities that one would need if they were building a startup. And what's more interesting is the prior to BCG, where I spent over a decade in VC and operating roles in venture and private equity backed companies. So I was what's called an operating partner in the fund. So I did help look at deal flow, but I spent a lot more of my time rolling up my sleeves and getting involved with the companies once we invested. And I usually went in for interim roles. So that could be anywhere from 6 months to 18 months to 24 months. And I would help the company get to the next milestone. And it would be whatever the board was trying to achieve. So expand a new market, launch a new product or offering, help raise funding, close massive partnership deals. And I've done this across lots of sectors. So everything from ad tech to maritime data and analytics. Some of those companies are public now. They've been acquired. They've been merged. Some, like a number of startups, crashed and burned. And I've lived and worked all over the world, Middle East, UK, Europe. And now after a 10-year stint overseas, we relocated back to the US about a year and a half ago.
Amazing. Danielle, that was a wonderful introduction. And I think there are going to be a lot of people right now very interested to hear some of the insight that you have to offer. I don't think there's ever been a better time to consider starting a startup, but there's probably many things that people haven't considered or should be considering if they're going to do that, or even just join a startup. On that, your time advising VC, PE-backed companies is obviously giving you a lot of an understanding of what these firms value in terms of not just the engineers, but probably more so the leaders, which would include obviously engineering leaders. Is there any advice that you would give to engineers or leaders to help them thrive in that sort of that startup environment?
So look, I have a tremendous amount of respect and admiration for founders and entrepreneurs. I usually get involved a little after. I guess I just don't have that gene. And so first, just a lot of respect and admiration. And I think that there's so much research out there on why early stage companies fail or fail to raise follow on capital. And oftentimes it's not actually due to the tech or the software. And it usually comes down to lacking a product market. So the tech is critical. It needs to be robust. It needs to be scalable. It needs to be secure. And every engineer that's listening to this podcast is well equipped to solve those technical challenges. And those are big, hairy challenges. But when I think about startups, I personally evaluate them on three dimensions. And Matt will know this well because we talk about it a lot at BCG. And it's what we call a DVF framework: D, desirability; V, viability; F, feasibility. And if you're thinking about going out and raising capital, and by the way, we should have a whole chat around, should you go out and raise venture or should you bootstrap? I always recommend bootstrapping in the early days, because then there's a whole host of reasons why.
I really want to dive into that because it's great to hear those lessons from the front line type thing where they're a little bit counterintuitive to what people might first think about. I really want to dive into that in a second, but I love this framework as well, Danielle. You're right. I use this all the time. So let's do the DVF framework.
Okay. So if you're working on building a company, I would be thinking about those three dimensions. So let's just go through them in a bit more detail and we can have a chat about them. And I think they're all important. And I think when you're thinking about them, it's which one is most risky to what you're doing with your startup, because different dimensions spike depending on what the business is. So the first D is that desirability dimension. So are you addressing a user, a customer need and pain point? And whose pain are you solving? And why is someone going to be willing to adopt this solution, especially if they have to switch from something they're currently doing, migrate over, start paying you? What else is in the market? And how have you gotten some early traction? Have you spoken to people? Have you done any research? Are there early signs of life here? What kind of feedback have you received? And how have you adapted it? No one who goes in and pitches something like spends 10 years doing that exact thing they originally pitched. It always pivots. And that's based on market feedback. And you should expect that. So that's the first dimension, is just making sure someone actually wants the solution, and that there's a willingness to pay. The second dimension is that feasibility dimension. And feasibility is where the technical angle hits. So can this product be built? Is the tech ready for prime time? We look at a lot of interesting businesses, but sometimes the TRL, the tech readiness level, just isn't there. But also, is it operationally feasible? So a lot of business ideas have aspects of tech, but they also have operational aspects. So Matt and I worked on one new business idea, and that business is still live in the market today, and it's called Field. And it's a software tool for field workers who are out at risky job sites. So think about a electricity or gas field worker, or someone working on a new highway construction project. These are pretty risky situations. And one of the issues that we were trying to burn down, the risk we were trying to burn down there, was operational feasibility. So these are people that are out at a site. There's not a Wi-Fi connection. They're not sitting at a desk with a laptop. So how do you give them a tool that they can use in the field that's going to report back to HQ in a way that's not going to be completely disruptive to the way that we work? So there, I would say it was a big operational risk of trying to figure out how to get them a mobile solution, no matter their location, and for it to have communication capability. So that's a very different risk than like a tech readiness level risk. The tech existed. It was more how we were going to get it into the field. And then the third dimension is that viability one. And this is where a VC investor, or any investor, even if you're raising angel money, would really care about. So this is the financial viability of the business. And this is where an engineer might want a co-founder that spikes on this dimension if they perceive that they're weak here. I've worked with engineers who are great here, and they get the economics and they get the business. But sometimes I think people perceive that they have a weakness if they don't have an MBA or they've never spent time outside of engineering. And this is about the numbers. How much is it going to cost to fund this journey, to build out this solution? How much money you think it's going to make, and when and how? What's the go to market? Is it a SaaS business? How do you envision charging? What's the total addressable market? I'm working with a startup now, and we just had to pitch it to the corporate investment committee. And the TAM, total addressable market, is just too small for them to justify it. So we had to go back to the room and we had to think about, okay, how can we revisit the segments we're targeting? And how can we reevaluate the timeline? So one of the things we did is said, okay, we need to go international a lot earlier to get after a bigger market. We need to think about tweaking the product so that we can get a bigger addressable market. And so this is something that you're going to be under a microscope with a potential venture investor, because they need everything that they're making a bet on to be a potential home run. They don't go for singles and doubles. They need the home run. They need the deal that's going to make the fund. And so this is a key one for an investor, which is why if you can get those early signs of life on the first dimension, the desirability, is usually easier to get it checked.
Danielle, I'm really interested. I'm hearing a few, I want to try and tie a few threads together that I've been hearing recently. As I'm sure you very well, most VC firms are looking for one of their portcos, one of the companies in their portfolio to really be not just the home run, but the 1000x that pays off the whole fund. And I've been hearing a few different models recently. The idea of people chasing PE style returns, maybe 2 or 3 or 5 times instead of a 10 or 100 or 1,000 times returns, but also this idea of founder scale instead of VC scale, where there seems to be a bit of white space around for founders to start businesses that may not be attractive to VCs because they don't have that prospect of having that 1,000 times return, but may still be very good businesses nonetheless, just with slightly perhaps longer timeframes and a slightly smaller multiple. What I guess 2 questions coming out of that observation. What are your thoughts on that? Is this something that you're seeing as a trend? Is there any merit to those observations? Yeah. And is that something you'd recommend someone on those boundary conditions exploring? Is that something you think is worth exploring?
In my experience, when folks are trying to raise money, they should explore all angles because you just don't know where the
Yep.
check is going to come from. And it takes a long time to raise capital. Everyone
Yep.
always talks about, I went out and I got a term sheet that day and it was super competitive, but you don't hear all the other stories of pounding the pavement
Yeah.
for months and pre-socializing the
Yep. Yep.
round before you go out and getting friendlies and getting feedback. So it takes a long time. And I think there's lots of different routes to explore. So one is, can you go friends and family or can you go angels in the early days just to get some capital to pay yourself and get the business off the ground? And then I think there's lots of options. So there's certainly like the PEs that are doing growth capital these days, but I would say it'd be hard to get seed money from them. As long as you have
Yeah, for
some
sure.
proof points for them to deploy, and they have the ability to write a bigger
Yep.
check and keep writing you checks as you go. This question about is it different these days with what people are looking for in time horizons? I have seen a lot of the companies we've worked with go out to raise private equity sooner. They know they're gonna need a big bank of capital because they're going after something really ambitious. And so even while the business is in what I would say is the early stage, I've seen a few instances where people have a thesis around a topic and they're willing to write an earlier check if the company is in that space and they're willing to partner, especially with some of our big corporate partners, because there's brand name, there's recognition, there's reputation, there's existing customers, there's an existing route to market. And so I have seen some of those circumstances that were quite surprising when it first started happening, that private equity was coming to play earlier. And then I think there's also the strategics. So you're trying to develop a solution and your customers might be, I don't know, people who build wind turbines. So can they write you strategic capital? So I'm not sure I'm answering the question, but I think anyone who's listening to this, who's thinking about raising, should explore all avenues and get some market feedback. So that could be friends and family and angels and VC and growth cap and strategics. And the other thing that's like more important than where you get the money is who is writing the check and what are you going to be beholden to, because these are marriages. These people are writing a check. They're going to be sitting around the table. They're going to be giving you advice, and your future is very much tied to them. And so I would say that's a really important thing for someone to think about if they're going to be raising some dough from externals.
Yeah, I think that did answer the question. I was really trying to
Mhm.
hone in on how is the market for finance for startup businesses changing? Is it changing? If it is changing, what's it changing to? But I think that did answer the question.
I think that raises another question or topic. Okay, I'm an engineer. I'm thinking I would love to do something, but a lot of engineers don't necessarily have that business background. They may be really technical, but they don't have the knowledge of the business side. So they're going to partner with someone does have that. Be keen to know how they can bridge that gap. Engineering leaders in the companies you've worked with, what was their knowledge like? And was it an asset if that engineering person was really business savvy?
And just add on to it, the question in my mind that comes through that James has prompted is, what are the things that engineers most often lack when they're dealing with that part of the business? And what would be your advice to them of the things to try and get on top of to be successful?
Sure. So earlier in my career, it was actually really hard for me to manage engineers because I had never done the role and I still haven't done the role. So I had done product and I had done business development or account management or some of the analytics. And so I understood the role and I could understand how to mentor and coach. Engineering was always trickier for me. But I think for me as a manager, realizing I don't have to have all the answers. And then I look to the engineering team, especially folks like you, Matt, as that thought partner and just both sides being willing to learn from each other. So me willing to admit I don't have all the answers, especially when it comes to the tech and the data, and the engineering team be willing and open to understand some of the business fundamentals and mechanics of this specific business. If they're not well versed in it, goes a long way. Like both sides just be willing to have a great trusted partnership. So the first piece of advice is be that trusted partner. Bring solutions, make everyone's life easier, and don't just bring the challenges. We all know there's challenges, right? BCG, we worked on the client and we were trying to help them roll out new digital products and services. And they have two unique legacy systems where customer data was held. Anytime we spoke to the client, we got a no. No, you can't do that. We can't pull that. The guy who knows how to write the queries on vacation for 2 months. You're going into the queue. We can get that for you in 6 months. Oh, I'm not sure. We don't have a workaround for that. And it was really hard. There was no single source of truth. We spent so much time trying to understand the tech and the architecture and the capabilities. Be that trusted partner. Second, bring solutions. Okay, we can launch this in a pilot where we're going to have to do a lot of things manually, but let's just try it and see if we can get it to work and if it's delivering value. And if it is, then we can think about what we're going to do before they migrate away from these two legacy systems. And so engineering is really creative and they can think about, we might not be able to solve this like perfect state today, but here's how we would solve it over time. And here's how we'd solve it in a manual pilot. And here's how we'd solve it if we wanted to ramp it up before we were dealing with this like legacy system issue. So trusted partner and help educate everyone. Important for everyone to understand what's going on. And in a startup environment, it's critical for a limited engineering team. Everyone has limited resources to understand what drives the business, especially if the business is going out and trying to raise capital. So I worked with a company. We knew we were trying to raise a B round, and we knew that the investors were really looking to see if we can improve monetization. So every single feature and like all of our pricing models had to improve the monetization of the business. It was a B2C offering. And so I would say the engineering team was critical to help us think about the A/B testing, for us to think about how we're going to test different pricing and packaging. Um, and be able to really quickly get the data, get the analytics, and try new things. And so because everyone understood what we were trying to do, I think we came up with a lot more creative solutions when we went into the room and tried to say, what if we charge for this? Let's tweak the freemium model and try this other thing. And so once everyone was working towards the same objective, I think our life became a lot easier. And so I would say it comes down to a curiosity to understand how I'm often surprised, not just with engineers, but anyone in the team doesn't understand the business. How do we actually make money as a business? Not this one feature and like how we're going to get the data, but how does this business make money? Because that is what like any manager is accountable for when reporting to a CEO or to a board. And so that curiosity and everyone working toward the same objective, especially if that objective is to close a funding round, improve stickiness and adoption and monetization.
I'm reminded of an ex-colleague of ours. I'm sure he might be mentioning his name, Amit. One of his special tricks was to wander around the office asking people how the business made money. And it was always a very enlightening question. I would encourage anyone to do that. Danielle, I completely agree. I want to just tie back actually to your previous mention of the DVF framework, desirability, viability, feasibility. What I was pretty proud of, what I was proud of at DV, one of the things we did was we introduced this idea of the creative engineer. And the creative engineer, which we spoke to Carlton, I think, and Michael in that previous podcast about this idea. But one of the things about a creative engineer was too often, in my mind, engineers are left thinking only about feasibility. And what they end up doing is they end up saying, oh, no, you can't do that. That's not going to work. And what I thought is a good hack, and here's a bit of advice for engineers trying to lock into what Danielle's saying. One way that you can do that is by adding to that feasibility bucket, you add possibility as well as feasibility, right? So your job as a creative engineer is not just to talk about, oh, this doesn't work, but it's actually to turn off and go, hey, what about if we did this? And I think that's to link back to your point about curiosity. The best people that I've ever worked with are the most curious. They're the kind of people who say, what about if we did this? What about if we could, and often it's the engineers that have those technical insights that don't really come up when you talk to customers, right? Or they don't really come up when you talk to product people. They only come up because some engineer found some weird blog post on Hacker News and went, hang on, this technology is interesting. I wonder what would happen if we combine this with that. And I'm not suggesting just to throw the next sharp thing at every problem you're trying to solve, but it's just the addition of possibility to the mix, which I think is very helpful as an engineer when you're working with other folks in
I
the business.
100% agree. It's a quality like that extends beyond just engineering. In general, working with people who are
Yeah.
creative problem solvers is more of a pleasure and enjoyable experience for everyone. I think about legal. Think of all the businesses not that we built together that have a lot of legal and regulatory issues. When you're sitting across the
Yes.
table from
Yep.
the legal team and the compliance team, all you get is a no. Nope, you can't test it. Nope, Beulah, it doesn't work. Nope, we can't build it this way. That is a very unpleasant experience when the team has been crunching away for 6 months to just be shot down. When they say, what if we did this? And what if we did that? It just is more enjoyable for everyone. And so, yeah, 100% for an engineering team to be creative, but in general, it's just an important quality of anyone on the team, I think, especially now. Like the tech is evolving so fast that all of us have to be curious and create because it's going to pass us by.
Completely agree. I call that the level of commodity. The level of commodity with the tech stack these days is right. It has risen so quickly and continues to rise increasingly quickly that you're almost starting from the point of view now where you don't have, there's a whole bunch of questions you don't really have to think about too much because you can literally just get that as a service. All right. And so it's contingent on everyone to be going, all right, what can we do with this rather than how do I solve this problem that's already solved?
Obviously, a lot of advantages for having anyone in an engineering role or a leadership role being curious. The top engineer being curious because they need to know why, but then educating the rest of the team on why. But sometimes those engineers have to be curious to find that information out. But if everyone is on that same page, I can see how it would make a big difference. I was also going to mention a lot of the companies I work with, they'll do an interview process where they might give a problem and they will deliberately leave out information. What separates the really top engineers with the not so top engineers is usually the curiosity. So it's asking those questions like they may ask to develop a solution to a problem. Some engineers will just go, oh, I think I know the answer to that, and they'll start solving that problem. But then they didn't ask whether this was an MVP or for a big telecom company. So I think that is a good takeaway for engineers is always be curious.
We had a take home challenge for our engineers in the early days. We hired a lot of engineers as Danielle over the time. And it amused me to find out after we'd run this test multiple times that there was a big mistake in it. The first person to spot it wasn't the first person to do the test. It was probably the fifth or sixth or seventh person to do the test was the first person to spot it. And I went, wow, we all had what we thought was the answer in our head and we were reading what we wanted to read. And it was really quite an egregious error. I left it in there on purpose for it just exactly to pick out who's going to be the next person to find this error. Because what I wanted them to do, to your point, James, what I wanted these people to do was to talk to us and go, hey, hang on, this isn't clear. What does this mean? Or how do I solve this? Just a simple question of how much time should I spend on this? Should I do this in my lunch break or should I take a week to do it?
Yeah.
And just getting not like intentionally not having information in it so that people did that. It was so instructive about people's really talks to people's
And I'm
curiosity.
a big fan,
Yeah.
James. I don't know if you do this with everyone, but I'm a big fan of those types of exercises. What it shows how serious is this person about the job? Because how much did they invest and how much time and effort did they put in? And also this, look, I didn't know the answer, so I made this assumption. Great. Walk me through
Mm.
it because then I
Mm.
can debate with you. Was that the right assumption? And so for all these reasons, I'm with you completely. I'm a big fan of, yes, have the chat and test for the cultural
Yeah.
fit. And is this person going to make my life easier or more difficult to work with? But also, like, how do they think? What's their thought process? How do they communicate? This communication when you're working in multidisciplinary teams and not everyone is like you is a challenge. So for all those reasons, I'm a fan of those types of exercises.
Yeah, I think they're becoming, well, they're probably not becoming, they're popular. I have a client I'm working with at the moment and they do brain teasers. They do problem solving that has nothing to do with coding on these engineers because they're not
Interesting.
really that worried about necessarily tech stacks or it's more about like the attitude, the way they go about thinking. So I'm sure that will become even more popular now with the way technology is becoming like coding languages, for instance, are probably less important as opposed to how you go about solving those technical problems.
Yeah, I really, what's the right word? I want to say, I was going to say reject, but reject's not quite the right word. I really get uncomfortable with the tendency to be much more specific about hiring people based on the tech stack. I find that troubling. You talk to anyone who's been in the industry for any more than 10 years, really 15 or so years, they've seen it more tech come and go than you would imagine. And so what you actually want is you want someone who knows how to think, not knows how to tick boxes on a list of language features or
Mm.
whatever it might be. I find that stuff rather useless relative to the ability to be able to think and be curious. All right.
Danielle, you've worked across different continents. You've worked in the US, Europe, Israel, and you've managed global teams in all of those. So they weren't necessarily local teams, I'm assuming. There's a lot of teams that are managed or dispersed now, especially since COVID. What are your strategies for managing in global teams?
It's hard, right? The cultural differences, the language differences. It's a challenge for sure. But I have a few tricks that I use, and I'm sure many folks who deal with this are doing similar things. And so I'll draw an example. I worked with a Swedish gaming company, but I was the USA based. I worked with an Israeli ad tech startup, but all of our tech partners, Yahoo, Google, Microsoft, were US based. And in both of those instances, I'd highlight a few things that were really helpful and useful for me to manage teams or manage customers or partners that are dispersed. The first is, and this is like obvious, but I'll say it anyway, is invest in the face time and building relationships. So it's really hard to build relationships and establish trust when everyone is fully remote and distributed. So the more for me personally that I can spend time with a team or get them to spend time together, I think it goes a long way to building like longer term cooperation and good team dynamics. And it's not realistic or cost effective to fly people all over the globe every week. But the more you can have a cadence, or if you're taking on a new role and develop personal and professional relationships and investing that time just went a long way when we're under pressure. We're under a deadline for a release or a bug surfaces and everyone has to work round the clock to fix it on an urgent issue for a customer over the weekend. So the relationship building. The other thing that I found is really important is team norming and ways of working and revisiting that if it's not working and making sure any latecomer to the team gets onboarded. So when you have these teams that are spread across multiple time zones. One team is waking up and the other is signing off for the day and going to bed. And so, what is the team norming? Are we going to use Slack? Are we going to use Teams? Are we going to have a bi weekly sprint review that's going to be painful for someone because it's going to be 7 p.m. for someone and 7 a.m. for someone else, and we'll flip it? And how are we going to communicate emergencies and issues? Are we going to use WhatsApp? Are we going to use email? What is the established way this team wants to communicate? And by the way, I'm not the one dictating this, even if I'm the manager. Like the team should determine how they want to communicate. And I've worked with lots of different teams that have lots of different choices. I never used WhatsApp till I moved abroad, and WhatsApp was the thing. So great, that's the thing we're using. And what are our boundaries? Who has childcare pickups and drop offs and doesn't work Friday or is helping with a parent situation or training for a marathon? What are those things? And shared calendars and just dealing with a lot of the administrative stuff to create that flex for people to get the job done. We just had a new joiner join one of our teams, and he was based in Brazil and he was an engineer on the team, and he just went silent. We wouldn't hear from him for 3 days. I'm sure he was working and had good intent, but that was actually on us. We didn't do the norming with this engineer of, look, every morning everyone checks in on Slack and says what they're going to do that day. And every afternoon they send, they do it, or they run into a roadblock that needs to get solved the next day. So we wouldn't hear from this person. And I think it was actually our fault because we never did the proper onboarding and the norming because they joined the team several weeks after we were already in the current sprint. And he didn't have ill intent, but it was our perception like, oh, this guy, I don't know if he's delivering. But then once we did the norming, he did check in, he did check out. He was really responsive. We just needed to do that proper norming and onboarding. And then I would say revisiting it if it's not working. Like we said we were going to do this and it's not working. And so what are we going to do to pivot? And then the final thing is, even though like I often now have a leadership role, I really try not to make the teams adapt to me. I try to adapt. And it could be something really silly, like they do stand up in a language that isn't a language I speak. Like I'll sit in, I'll listen, someone will translate it after for me. Doing like whatever is part of the culture. So in the UK, it might be going to the pub for happy hour. In Sweden, it was doing fika breaks, like just learning and enjoying and appreciating. When in the Sweden office, we all took off our shoes. Like I've never worked in an office environment where everyone left their shoes at the door, but you adapt. And then whatever the team likes to do to blow off steam, escape rooms, just go with it, even if it's not your thing.
I just want to add a bit of practical experience onto the norming one there. And it's on two lessons, like a lesson and a meta lesson. One of the things that I found super useful was doing a care and feeding document that we remember we always used to do these care and feeding documents for the directors and the VPs and partners and so on. And it's quite simple. It's like a one-page thing. It just says, this is when I'm at my best. This is when I'm at my worst. This is how to deal with me. This is who to call and so on. And I found this fantastic because I got a one-page view on how to work with everyone. And then I just, my style, I just went completely normative with it. And this is like the one true way to do this and everyone should do it. Right up until someone told me that it was the dumbest thing that they never seen. And that they were like really offended by it. And they thought it was patronizing. And I went, oh, wow. Okay, I've learned two useful lessons here. One is this is really how I understand and how I can work with other people. But the other lesson I learned, the meta lesson was maybe not everyone behaves like appreciates things the same way that I do. So I went from just being completely normative with it to being, okay, all right, folks, this is what I'm going to do. If you if this is useful to you, that's great. If not, that's fine too. We can work out another way to go. And then on that last point, I've got a little phrase that I use all the time when I'm coaching CTOs, which is this idea of speak in the language of your audience, right? It's so important to speak in the language of your audience, not your language. And you just said exactly that, right? You are listening in the language of your audience in that case, but it's more or less the same thing. It's so important to be able to phrase the things, the messages that you want in the language of the people you hope are listening to you.
You hope they're listening. Yeah. And it's tricky,
Yeah.
right? Language dynamics are tricky, but someone will always translate for you
Yeah.
after.
Mm. Now, moving on to some more practical advice here, Danielle. A couple of things we like to ask each week is something, I guess, something practical, and often failure or regret is something that people really listen to. If you were to think back over your career, is there any regrets you have? And on top of that, perhaps something that you don't regret doing that was a tough decision at the time that you feel like may have shaped where you are now?
Hmm. So I try not to dwell on the regrets because I do think I've learned something with all the hops that I've made, and there have been a lot. But in one instance, I do regret not quickly walking away when I stepped into a role that I could tell within the first hour was not a good fit. And I should have done more diligence on the two founders before I took the role. I should have spoke to people who worked with them. I should have maybe spent more time in the office, sat in on a few leadership meetings, understood the team dynamics. But I knew really early on in the first, like I said, in the first hour that it wasn't going to work. I just did not fit with the culture. It was a really aggressive, confrontational, conflict-filled team environment that was set by the founders, and I wasn't gonna be able to change that even though I was in a really senior role, and that every day just had that burden of stress and aggressiveness, and how I that's not how I bring my best self to work. And I should have just pulled the plug and said, I just don't think this is going to fit. But I was really worried about the investors and the board, and we had some PR planned. But if you don't fit and you're not going to have joy, get out. It's just not worth it. So that one I do regret because um, fit is so key.
Mhm.
I would say one of the non-regrets is I got a call from, one of the funds I worked with a lot, and they offered me a big role, like the most senior role I had. It was leading a really large team and managing relationships that were a massive source of we're trying to go public. These relationships were pretty never managed a team that big, and I had never negotiated these massive long-term agreements. And the lesson there was like, just say yes. Like you'll figure it out as you go. There will be people there who want you to succeed. They're spending a lot of time recruiting you in. And it would have been really easy for me to be like, I never
Mhm.
worked in this sector, and I've never managed those types of folks. And I've never, and I've never, and I've never. So I should just not do it. But someone thinks you're capable. And even if they don't think you're capable, throw your hat in the ring anyway. What's the worst case scenario? You get a no, but at least someone saw that had that curiosity that we spoke about earlier, and you had that ambition. And I took the role and I loved it. And it was one of the best roles I've ever had. And I still keep in touch with that team to this day. In fact, I brought people from that team to different companies because I had such a great experience with them and they became like great trusted partners for me. And just say yes. You will figure it out. Just Nike, just do it. And then you'll figure it out as you go. You don't need to come in day one with all the answers.
I really love this because one of the things that grinds my gears enormously with people, some people, and I think I'm just picking up more on it as I get a bit older, but um, people often negotiate against themselves with themselves before they've even started. And I find it incredibly frustrating. And so the lesson, like the kind of takeaway lesson, Danielle, to make what you said practical is listen out for yourself, arguing against yourself for something you haven't even tried. And if you hear yourself doing that, just give yourself an uppercut and say, look, hang on, maybe I just need to say yes, and then be prepared to fail rather than construct these reasons to not do something just because you think you may fail. I don't know whether there's more of this happening with people. I think imposter syndrome is becoming more and more of a thing with people, and I have a little sympathy for people
Mm.
who have that, having had bouts of it myself over the years. But yeah, just look out for that like telling yourself, constructing reasons why something can't work before you've even attempted to do it. To me, is really self defeating behavior, and look out for that and stomp on it when you see
Yeah,
it.
100%. And in my experience, I see females are more guilty of this than males, especially in the sector where we all spend a lot of our time. And I find that I often have to encourage the female, go for the promotion. Again, what's the worst case scenario? So I completely agree.
Last week was a woman in a fireside chat thing I was doing for a bunch of folks just starting out in their career. And this one put her hand up and she's quite young, graduated. Turned out she actually worked for, I won't say any names, she worked for us for a while. She was fantastic. She didn't have a computing background, but she had a background in linguistics, right? And I sort of picked up on this immediately because she obviously knows about languages. It just wasn't that she knew about computer languages, but she was absolutely fantastic. But she said to me, how do you cope with imposter syndrome? And a weird thought came to me in the moment when she asked the question. And I said, because I like reframing things. If often I find something I can't do or I cannot understand, what I try and do is reframe it somehow, either in language that I do understand or in a way that makes sense to me. And I just said to her, look, the way I think about imposter syndrome is I reframe it as misplaced humility. And rather than think about imposter syndrome as a negative thing, humility is actually a good thing, right? Humility, the best combination personality trait is actually arrogance plus humility, right? Arrogance on its own and humility on its own, it can be problematic, but arrogance plus humility is actually a great combination. But I said to her, it's just reframe your imposter syndrome as misplaced humility. And that's a good thing, right? Now, all you need to do now that you realize it's a good thing, now you just need to direct it in the right way. And she went, And actually, she became a fantastic employee. Actually, she was absolutely brilliant. I mean, not because of my advice. I'm not suggesting that,
Perfect.
but she was very good before she met
I'm
me.
sure it helped, Matt. Yeah. I am curious back on your regret, Danielle, and obviously you now know that you probably should have stepped away on day one. Out of interest, how long did it take you to enough was enough, and what was it that actually pushed you to walk away eventually?
So it was over a year, which I'm shocked to say that I held on that long because I just kept thinking maybe I can change the dynamic because a lot of the employees didn't like working in that culture either. And I felt for this company to achieve their ambition, they needed to go from being like this family of a couple people to we grew to 75 plus people during my tenure there. We signed a lot of new customers, a lot of new deals. I just kept thinking like I can change them. But going back to our earlier conversation, like you need to adapt to the people you're working with, not force them to adapt to you. And I was the outlier and I should have just done it. But it's hard to admit defeat. And it's
Mm.
hard to say to not
Yeah.
take it personally that I like it wasn't a good fit. Maybe I was a failure in that situation.
Was there also any part of you that felt I need to stay in this role now? This is my role. It's not going to look good if I leave after a short period of time.
Yeah, of course. And that were very long term with some of the investors and waste time. And I did have another situation after that where a board suggested that I work with another company and I spent some time with the CEO, really spent time with the CEO and realized, you know what? For whatever reason, it's going to be a hard dynamic to work with individual. Like our communication styles are different.
Yeah.
And so I walked away from that one. So at least I did learn a lesson, but I took a
Yeah. Yeah.
beating to learn that lesson.
It's a tricky one because I see that often with engineers who leave, so they may not make it through a probation period or they choose to leave on their own. So within a few months, and people perceive them as a problem. So they go for their next role and it's, oh, why didn't it work out? And the perception is there was something wrong with that person. So I think it's a tough call and you can see why people just stick it out. But I think and it could depend on your own personal circumstances, whether the market's good enough to find another role. But yeah, it's definitely great advice to not stick in it if you can find another way sooner rather than later.
Yeah, I would say like with the caveat that if it's your first job or even your second job,
Mhm.
you do have to stick it out because otherwise you get
That's really good
as a
advice.
chauffeur.
Maybe not even first job or second job, but first job in that role.
Yeah.
If you've gone from being a tech IC and then now you're a leader for the first time and it's that's your first one, and do you want that to look like a failure
Right.
on paper? Look, I think we're
Mm.
coming up to time. And what I like to do, Danielle, at the end of, it's the last question. I reserve the right to ask the last question on our podcast, which is we've asked everyone so far. And the question is a simple one, but often doesn't have a simple answer. Imagine I could give you a magic telephone and that telephone would allow you to make a phone call to yourself 20 years ago, 25 years ago. What would you say based on, and maybe linking it back to some of the things that we've mentioned today? What might you give what piece of nugget of advice might you give yourself 20 years ago that if you had that, you could make that
Oh
phone call?
goodness, can we give stock tips and investment advice?
Yeah,
That
you can. Unfortunately, it might be to yourself in another timeline, so you won't benefit from that.
oh goodness. And James warned me there'd be a surprise question. So I think probably just enjoy the ride. And I give this advice to a lot of our BCG colleagues as well. If you work at Boston Consulting Group, you're the type A overachiever profile and when can I get my promotion? And am I in the promotion window? And how can I advance? And how can I do this? And how can I check this box? The thing is, I'm 20 plus years into my career and I feel like it went by in a flash. And I too was always like trying for the next level. I think take a breath. It's a marathon, not a sprint. Everyone works on their own horizon. Everyone has situations. I took time off when I had kids. Sometimes I'm taking lesser demanding jobs to be around more with the family. Everyone is on their own path and you're not competing. You're just think about yourself and enjoy the ride. Otherwise it's going to be pretty miserable. And I think that goes for life and career, but certainly for career, just enjoy it. Take what you can and learn and enjoy spending time with your colleagues and learning from them.
Great advice.
I think that's great advice. Yeah. Yeah. I've often heard people say that your career isn't necessarily a straight line. It's a squiggly line. Don't feel like everything has to be that perfect role after the other one. I think we've probably run out of time. There's definitely a lot more in there that we would have liked to have probably touched on. I think there's heaps of valuable experience that you could offer our audience, and perhaps we organise to get you on back down the line. But what I did really like about today's episode is a little bit different to who we've spoken to previously, but it definitely, there's obviously a lot of crossover in the advice, but I think hearing some of that advice to people that were thinking about a startup or work in a startup or contemplating starting a startup is definitely of interest and very relevant to right now. Thanks, Danielle. Thank you so much for joining us. It's been great talking to you today, and thanks for coming on.
Thanks, James. Thanks, Matt. Always a pleasure to catch up with you both. Have a great holiday.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
That's a wrap. Thanks, Danielle, for joining us today and breaking down how engineers and investors can work together.
If you found this useful, please hit follow and then send the podcast link on to someone that you know who's thinking about launching a startup.
And if you're building something new, don't just focus on feasibility, desirability, and viability. Think about possibility too.
Thanks, James.
Thanks, Matt.